drinking, smoking, and wearing pants, which I think is hilarious.
Real men shit.
Yeah, real men shit, right?
Hello.
Hey,
Welcome to Left Unread. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We're two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
That's right. We're simply two dictatorship of the proletariat glazers.
That's right. And this episode we have read We Are Heirs of the World's Revolutions by Thomas Sankara.
Yeah, it's a collection of speeches from Thomas Sankara's kind of tenure as the president of Burkina Faso. He was born in 1949 in the then French Upper Volta. Thomas Sankara grew up in an Africa that was still finding its footing among its newly found independence. He rejected seminary school to join the military and found his own radical path, studying in places like Madagascar and fighting in the military, of the newly independent Upper Volta. In 1983, he became the leader of that nation in an officer's coup backed by what he calls a democratic and popular revolution. He quickly sought to implement real and revolutionary change in this landlocked country of 8 million people, 7 million of which were still peasants. His revolutionary energy carried the country for 4 exciting years until his betrayal by his closest friend led the country back into neocolonialism for another 30 years.
Yeah, watch your fucking backs.
Yeah, a really tragic story. If you know nothing about Thomas Sankara, you should look into it. Mostly because his story can be really covered quickly in a Wikipedia page. It was 4 years in the 80s, and then, exactly as we said, his good friend and one of the original founders, by the way, one of the people that helped plan the initial coup with him that put him in power is the one that betrayed him. There's some pretty... It's not super public evidence, but there is evidence out there that the French were heavily involved. So, you know me, it's 100 years of fuck the French. I don't know if they can ever really atone for their crimes. And watch your backs. No new friends. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, echoes of Fred Hampton and William O'Neill for sure.
Yeah, man. Yeah, so we read this really because I think that Thomas Sankara gets a lot of internet attention. And I think I really just didn't know that much about his story or what he actually wanted. We'd seen him mentioned recently in a couple of times, particularly when we were talking about nature. And so we wanted to give this a crack. It's a collection of his speeches. Yeah. What did you think of this book as a whole?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. It's only 4 or 5 speeches, and the bulk of that really comes from 2. One is like a speech that he gave at the founding of Burkina Faso in 1983, I want to say. And then another is his address to the UN General Assembly. That's the bulk of it. There are a couple others that are a little shorter, including his address at the anniversary of for Che Guevara.
Yeah. A week before he was assassinated.
Yeah, so much like you, I knew of Sankara more than I knew about Sankara. He's often cited, often referred to, but I didn't really know a whole lot about it. So about him, about Burkina Faso. So I was really stoked to read it, and I did really enjoy it. He knows how to turn a phrase, that's for sure. And I think my number one takeaway is how much I appreciate his adherence to internationalism in a purely revolutionary sense. It's really refreshing to see someone talk about his own nation's struggle for independence, struggle for autonomy, and in the context of that, seeing the mirrors globally of other colonized people fighting the same sorts of fights. And really drawing the lines between those on the national stage. He's talking to the fucking UN General Assembly, and he's calling out Palestine, he's calling out Morocco, he's calling out East Timor, that's super dope. Yeah.
He directly says that, Israel will never find peace as long as they're waging war by the direction of the U.S., essentially, under the funding of the U.S.
Yeah.
And, what an insane thing to say. Really lovely, might I add, that you can go and see this. You can watch him give this address on YouTube.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah. I was like 84. That's a little, maybe it's recorded, maybe it's not. And there is actually a, what seems to be maybe some kind of Thomas Sankara group affiliated YouTube channel that has a video recording. And the most lovely thing about it is that it starts with a splash screen, which is clearly from a Burkina Faso television channel.
Oh, dope.
And I'm like, this is so nice. It's like literally someone standing in the crowd, really yellowed 70s camera zoomed in. At first you can't tell if the audio is going to work. It's really incredible. It's in French. If you speak French, congrats. It's not Atonement. Sorry, it's in French, but you can watch it, and I think that that's really exciting because the stuff that he's saying in that speech particularly is like really fiery stuff. I mean, it's incredible stuff. At one point, he says like, if we want to build a new economic order, the old one must be destroyed. I can't beat around the bush any longer.
Yeah.
Right, and it's crazy, man.
Yeah, there's this really interesting, this really delicate balance that he's striking there in that speech, because he starts off kind of moderating, for the room, recognizing the people to whom he is speaking, and like, I don't know, does a little bit, maybe I should find an example, but does a little bit where he's like definitely placating to the folks before buttering them up, so to speak, before he goes in and says like, and that's why we need to destroy the imperialist regime.
Yeah, I mean, it's really incredible, and I can't help but to think of Thomas Sankara's position, in the middle of the 80s. 83 is when he came to power, and you just had to think about what the state of global communism is at that point. I mean, the Soviet Union, it's not Gorbachev yet. He's not until 85, but they're not in the happiest of times, a stagnating era, perhaps. Tito is gone. Yugoslavia is on the downward spiral at this point. Mao died 8 years ago at this point. So it's really a tough place to be. And Thomas Sankara is positioning himself kind of in the middle of this almost a third world movement in an era where the third world movement is kind of long gone. If you look into the history of who he associated with, it's a lot of Fidel Castro.
Yeah, Castro.
A lot of Jerry Rawlings, the leader of Ghana, which is directly to the south of Burkina Faso. Mm-hmm. To think of Thomas Sankara giving that speech at the UN, right? He is standing there in his red beret, military garb, staring out at all of these faces, and I can't imagine what he's feeling. There cannot be that many friendly faces in that crowd. He's looking out at essentially the heads of imperialism on a global stage,
yep.
And he still has the guts to say, "Free Palestine, fuck Israel, fuck Morocco." That's what he's saying. Fuck imperialism. And it's still socialism forever, man. It's still communism forever. He's still upholding Marx's revolutionary ideal. And he does do a little bit of that placation, I will say. He gives alms to the American Revolution as well. But I just can't imagine the guts it takes to stand on the stage of the UN and give that kind of speech.
Yeah. Based as hell.
Yeah. Really incredible stuff. So
I guess since we brought it up, I'll throw out a couple of quotes that stood out to me about his internationalism. I think it's dope just to see, his solidarity with the people of Palestine.
Yeah.
At the end of his speech in 1983 on page 58, he's like naming some of the folks with whom he feels solidarity. He says respect for each other's independence, territorial integrity, and national sovereignty. And he goes on to say, we have active solidarity and support for the national liberation movements in all of these places, he says, to the Namibian people under the leadership of SWAPO, to the Sahrawi people and the struggle to recover their national territory, to the Palestinian people for their national rights. This is 1983, and I think it's super dope to see how clearly his eyes were opened to settler colonialism, to imperialism, and all of the national struggles that were happening globally. And to see, I don't know, it's almost like Maoist, to see how he situates himself not above or below, but in solidarity directly beside these other national movements.
Yeah.
It's fucking dope.
This is probably the best time to say this because I don't know if we'll really talk about his speech about Che, but I really just love what he says about holding up Che not as a god or an idea, but as you would a brother that you can speak with.
Yeah.
That's really what this is. It's like Thomas Sankara is not some incredible golden idol of a leader. He's a real person, okay? He's a real man who really tried his best with a nation that was at probably some of the hardest conditions to try to build socialism in. And what he did was he tried to apply these lessons of socialism from people like Lenin, people like Mao, and build a new society, and it's tough. It's tough to think about what he had to go through. And, I was talking to Chris about this earlier because he's lauded in almost all of these ways. The only critiques I saw about Thomas Sankara and other researches is one's about human rights, about using tools of repression against internal enemies. And it's that's always the critique of, one party states, that kind of thing. And it's not so black and white to say yes, these people should have been repressed. No, they shouldn't have been repressed. One example that was brought up in a documentary I watched was there was a big teacher strike and the Revolutionary Council was very straightforward about it. They were saying, you're either here for the revolution or you're not. And so what they did was they fired all the teachers. And in a country like Burkina Faso, where there really weren't that many. There were not teachers left, you know? And so what Thomas Sankara did, and this is a bit of credit to his own kind of Leninism or Maoism and integration of the people, is that he said, you know, you are now revolutionary teachers, and they mobilized the people to fill these gaps. As former teachers, you know, I'm sure that we have our own thoughts on that, but still, it's like, what can you do in that kind of situation? What possibilities do you have as someone leading a country who's truly trying to lift the people up to the position where, as we talked about on the last episode, where they have habitualized government to the point where you don't need this Committee for National Defense or whatever?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts about that. I mean, first, in regards to education, there's this difficult situation that Burkina Faso would have been in at that time, because being a formerly colonized nation, there were educators already in Burkina Faso that were trained under the administration of Upper Volta. You know what I mean? And it's difficult then to parse out who actually are the teachers that are sympathetic to the revolutionary cause and who are going to be reactionaries, who are going to continue to perpetuate the same sort of like education of imperialism that would have come from the former administration, or whatever you want to fucking call them, the settlers. Colonizers. And so, like, there's something really kind of, you're automatically in a difficult position there. Those teachers would have been living under intense contradiction in that situation, being, you know, made to teach whatever they're being made to teach in a particular way, while also living the realities of what it means to be a colonized person. So I think the likelihood that there were revolutionary educators or educators sympathetic to the revolutionary cause was high. And so to fire all of them seems misguided, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can't speak on what the concrete details of that situation were, right? But I'll say at the same time, as a former educator, and one of the things that really fucking irks me is that people that call themselves teachers because they know how to do something themselves, and they think that, like, doing it in front of people is teaching. And that really fucking irks me because it's a totally different skill set to understand how to do something yourself versus understanding how to teach other people to do it. And the pedagogy that needs to go behind that, those are different things. And so the idea that anyone can be a, quote, revolutionary teacher is also, I think, pretty dangerous. Yeah. Well, you know, I think that there's pros and cons of it, right? At the point at which you're dealing with the teacher striking, sure, I would prefer some kind of compromise there, right?
Yeah.
If you're dealing with the point after where it's like, we now have a lack of teachers, period, it's like, what do you do in that scenario? I do really appreciate the idea of mobilization for that. And, you know, honestly, what it made me think of was something we haven't really read that much about on the show is when Lenin talks about bourgeois specialists. You know, like, how much is a teacher, a professor in that sense, a kind of example of that bourgeois specialization?
Well, dude, Sankara even kind of calls that out. Yes, at the bottom of 44, top of 45, he's talking about the petty bourgeois and their kind of relationship to imperialism, and he's effectively saying, you know, scratch the liberal fascist bleeds, how the petty bourgeois will, in order to maintain their comfort, have a tendency to side with the imperialists and always kind of, in a reactionary kind of way, edge the revolution back to be closer to that imperialist line, so to speak. And he says it's no longer enough to call oneself a revolutionary. Knowing how to link revolutionary theory to revolutionary practice will be the decisive criterion from now on in distinguishing consistent revolutionaries from all those who flock to the revolution under motives that are alien to the revolutionary cause. There's another one, too.
Yeah, on page 40, he says that we have to cultivate revolutionary mistrust, like, amongst these people, you know?
Yeah.
I appreciate that, because it's not like an outright condemnation. It's just the idea that's like, you might not have our best interests at heart. You know, we still might need you, but we're watching.
Yeah, because even later on 65, he's talking about these petty bourgeois that go to be educated in Europe or whatever, and he says at the top, often the only things that they bring back from the European universities of which they are the products are their degrees and their velvety adjectives and superlatives. Like, they're not bringing back a consciousness of revolution, a consciousness of the people. They're bringing back ideology of the bourgeois, the ideology of imperialism, and letting it fucking fester and seep into the consciousness.
Well, you know, just to talk about that for a second, like, even in the first speech in this book, when he's talking about the initial liberation of Burkina Faso, or Upper Volta at the time, and he says that the bourgeois, the intelligentsia at the time, they set up these structures of power, and then as these crumbs kept falling down from imperialism, so to speak, like they became a more parasitical bourgeoisie. Like the systems that were set up as a result of this could only reinforce them as this kind of parasitical class. And I just think that it's so interesting because it's the way that it's like developing and kind of concretizing itself, you know? It's just a matter of like, what are you allowing to, like you said, to come in and fester? I don't know. I'm just thinking about that revolutionary mistrust again. It's like, I mean, there is a lot here where you can tell he's drawing directly from Mao. And it's just evident that it's because his country is a peasant country, you know? That's such a tough position to be in. One thing I really appreciate that he says is that the objective is just to make a situation where someone can get 2 meals and water via their own brains or hands. You know, it's like we still acknowledge that there is this kind of work for survival that happens in this country, but just facilitating the ability of that to happen as easily as possible is the goal of this transitional government, you know, in that sense. He is talking about building socialism and what that will take amongst a country of 7 million peasants.
Yeah. That's why I think, you know, arguments, you always hear that same tired, like, name one communist country that's ever been successful or whatever.
All of them.
Yeah, literally the answer is all of them. But to look at a situation like Burkina Faso, like, yeah, what are your measures of success? Did they have a fully industrialized nation that was, you know, run by the proletariat? No, they were working on fucking getting their basic needs met in order to facilitate that transition later, you know?
What proletariat, you know?
Exactly. They were peasants. And they're dealing with situations, I mean, on 67, he says, just to describe the former Upper Volta, 7 million inhabitants with over 6 million peasants, an infant mortality rate estimated at 180 per 1,000.
Yeah.
That's fucking crazy. I looked up some stats on that. I was like, what is the U.S. infant mortality rate now? We are ranked 54th globally, so not good.
Right.
And U.S. infant mortality rate is less than 6 to 1,000.
Yeah. That's 18%, man.
Yeah.
Like 18%, 1 in 5, 1 in 6 babies die.
Yeah. Like, that's not the same situation that other nationalist movements might have found themselves in, other socialist movements might have found themselves in. And so to like compare them like for like, I think is foolhardy and dumb, and it's obviously in bad faith.
Yeah,
but.
And if you want to talk about the success of communism, like Burkina Faso is a great example because what came from Sankara's policies were mass literacy drives, right? Mass development, mass land redistribution. There's one point where he talks about how they vaccinate 2.5 million children in 2 weeks.
Yeah, vaccination is the thing that you see brought up all the time when you talk about Sankara.
Yeah, exactly. Even in the 70s, even in the 80s when he was in charge, they were well aware of the ecological impact of the industrialization of Africa, right? He talks about the expanse of the Sahel Desert, 7 kilometers per year since 1973, right? That's only something that could be curtailed by us, okay? And Thomas Sankara is well aware of that. He's putting policies into place to prevent that kind of thing, not only mechanically, right, from top down, but by integrating these structures into society. He talks about how in Burkina Faso, every celebratory event is coupled with a tree planting.
I love that.
You know, that's exactly the thing I'm talking about. It reminds me of when we were reading Parenti, and he says that there is no secret to building a hospital. There is no secret to building a school. Our goals are lofty, but it's not that they are complex. The solutions can be something as simple as that. We're integrating this kind of thing into our society, right? Thomas Sankara says, when he's talking to the International Tree Association or whatever, right, he's saying it's not about bragging about what we've accomplished. It's about talking about the way we have changed the relationship between man and trees. When we read Ecology, the Highest Stage of Communism, Guillaume Swing, he mentioned specifically Burkina Faso's one village, one grove policy. Mm-hmm. The point of that is to reintegrate society on the village level into nature by connecting them and their livelihood, right, their success, their production directly to nature.
Yeah, and Sankara doesn't see that as separate from any other struggle. He says on 91, we therefore wish to affirm that the battle against the encroachment of the desert is a battle to establish a balance between man, nature, and society. As such, it is a political battle above all and not an act of fate.
Yeah.
That's great.
Exactly.
Love that.
And it's clear that he's pro-development, too. One thing I can say, sorry to punch left on this episode, but I just love what he says on 91. The unpunished disruption of the biosphere by savage and murderous forays on the land and air continues. And what he says is that we're not against progress, but we do not want progress that is anarchic or criminally neglects the rights of others. And there's just something to be said there about anarchy in that sense. And I'm not necessarily talking about anarchy in the cool sense. But, even when Marx talks about the way that the forces of the market control the world, he describes it as an anarchism of the market, this kind of a chaos. And it's like when we're talking about the ecology, the climate, the biosphere, any of that, fixing the problems that we have already created with that aren't going to come from randomness. They're not going to come from anarchy.
Yeah, it's a pretty clear argument for a centralized approach, for sure. And what I'm thinking of is, like he says, it's a political battle above all. To characterize Marxism in general as an economic system is inherently flawed because it's not purely an economic system. And Sankara is making it quite clear that this includes, through the balance of finding humanity's relationship to nature and society, that I don't know. I'm getting all wrapped up in like cultural revolution.
Yeah.
The culture and the way that we live, it's paramount to every other piece. It's connected. It's interconnected. That's what I want to say. And so like so much of the way that we live, like he said, everything that merits a celebration in Burkina Faso is culminated with the planting of a tree. That's, he says, a birth, he says a wedding, he's, like anything like that. Those things are culturally not really that similar, you know what I mean? But there is a similar reaction, a similar response that's built in culturally because they recognize that, like, we have to inhabit the earth. You know what I mean? Like, where else are we going to go? So in order to celebrate things like this, these accomplishments in our personal life, these cultural accomplishments in our personal lives, they're celebrated with the planting of a tree, which is tied into this whole fucking political battle of ecology, of nature, of finding that balance. That's never going to come if it's not intentionally planned, if it's not coming from a central intention. I don't know. Fuck.
I threw us off a little bit talking about anarchy because I just got a sly shot at anarchists. So sorry. Not to harp too much on the like tree planting thing, but I think that there's something in there about reconnecting what we are doing to nature. And I don't want to get too sentimental or anything, but it's like when you plant the seeds of growth in your life, you plant the seeds of nature too, like that kind of thing. But it kind of reminds me, honestly, on the last episode when we were talking about primitive Christianity being disconnected from its roots, primitive democracy being disconnected from its roots. We've disconnected ourselves from nature, and essentially what needs to be done is to reconnect those things. It's just about reintegrating those processes with our life. We're not talking about tree planting as a separate institution here. We're not talking about nature as a separate institution. We're talking about reintegrating it into society. We're talking about habitualizing nature into society. Just to echo exactly what we were saying on the last episode, it's the same kind of thing when we're talking about changing our relationship to nature. And it doesn't have to be something so mechanical as like a tree planting, but it is about understanding that our lives are, as he said, concomitant with nature.
Yeah, it's all interconnected, and there's already, it's like there needs to be a synthesis of our understanding of our relationship to nature between the human animal and the nature that has produced it. We see ourselves as separate.
There used to be a return.
We see ourselves as separate, and there really is, like, it doesn't mean that we need to fucking shed all our clothes and go, into some sort of primitivist kind of relationship with nature where we're hunter-gatherers again or anything like that. That's nonsense. What I mean by synthesis is like we have to acknowledge and recognize our relationship to nature and that it's a symbiotic relationship to a degree, and that like we need to live on the planet, and we also need to sustain that planet because it sustains us.
Yeah, it's not about going backwards. It's about understanding how to go forwards. It's about choosing how to go forwards. Yeah. We've talked a lot about the ecology on recent episodes, and I don't know, it's just really in there. By the way, I just love when Thomas Sankara says that he still holds the idea that Africa is underpopulated. Just a beautiful way to express the kind of chaos that we've wrought on Africa. It's the fact that like it could hold a countless population, It is underpopulated in that sense as to what is possible there. It's just that it's gone through the machine for so long.
Yeah. I guess there is one other thing that I thought was kind of interesting. One other point that he brings up that I thought was kind of interesting. It's about language and language as an intermediary.
Yeah.
I think it would probably be best to start with this quote, I guess, on 96. Because he says, on one hand, the French language is a vehicle for cultural alienation, but also it is through the intermediary of the French language that we read the great educators of the proletariat and all of those who, in a utopian or scientific manner, have put their pens at the service of the class struggle. And I think that there's something really interesting there, and it's, not something we've talked about a great deal or something that I've studied much myself, but there is that interesting contradiction with language, especially in a colonized nation, because obviously it's the language of oppression. In Burkina Faso, to speak French means you're speaking the language of the colonizer. But on the other hand, like he said, that's the only way that the people of Burkina Faso, the Burkinabe, would have access to thinkers like Lenin or Mao or whomever, the great educators of the proletariat. And it's also maybe the most fundamental shared characteristic among the people. You know what I mean? Like, your ability to speak to one another is the thing that grants the opportunity to share freely, communicate clearly, and forge bonds among the people. So there's a really interesting contradiction with language there that I think, I don't know, I guess I've always had a little bit of an discomfort with thinking about language like in a colonized nation, in a place like Burkina Faso. There's a part of me that's like, we need to reclaim an ancestral language, an indigenous language, something that's not been brought here by the oppressors. But at the same time, I don't know that that's a struggle worth having, especially at the onset.
Yeah. It reminds me of Stalin's fascination with language, honestly, and how he talks about how language is kind of outside of the class structure in that sense. And I just think that language just holds such an interesting relationship because it's not something that could be moderated in the same way. You can't stop someone from speaking a language, broadly speaking. Not to say it hasn't been tried.
Yeah, there can certainly be state repression, right?
Yeah.
And your ability to do things publicly might be stopped.
Right. Well, I'm thinking in two veins here. In one sense, I'm just thinking about the situation in Burkina Faso, and this kind of has to do with something that Thomas Sankara only talks about briefly. He talks about the way that imperialism seeks to reinforce tribalism. And I think that language is such an interesting part of that dynamic, because in what ways does holding those separations on a linguistic level, right, reinforce that same kind of separation on a societal level? The other sense in which I think Sankara makes a great point here when he talks about language being, as you said, the thing that is connecting all these groups, it reminds me of Fanon, honestly, when he says that the common basis of this is not the differences between one or the other ethnic groups. The commonality, the point of unity is that they were under French colonialism, and it's like, that's a point of unity here, is that they speak French. Obviously, on an operational sense, having everyone speaking the same language is useful. But there's just something interesting there, and particularly in the African context, if you look into the experiences of communist countries in Africa, you'll find that tribalism is something that comes up again and again. And even outside of Africa. I mean, I've talked about Yugoslavia and their attempt to ease ethnic tensions with a federative republic, that kind of thing. It's just really fucking tough. No one has found an effective solution yet. And so I think that Thomas Sankara is saying, here's something that already connects us, right? Here's something that we can already seize on, because we're not talking about the French of the colonizers. We're talking about a universal French. We're talking about French dialectically. Its relationship between what it stands in the metropole and what it stands in the rest of the globe. And they're seizing upon that. It's not something I know enough about to talk about so firmly, but I just think that it is something that is critical in this discussion as well, and I don't have enough to really lean on it.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the question that could be, the catalyst that lights the spark is like, why are we both speaking French?
Yeah.
Why are you and I both speaking English? There's something revolutionary in that question if you know how to follow it up.
Just to double up on my own point, I mean, I don't have the statistic written down, but I'm pretty sure that French isn't even that widely spoken in Burkina Faso. On top of that, French does serve more as a catalyst in Burkina Faso alone. Forget the international situation, because it's not like, I'm looking on, I guess this is page 27. There's the map and then all of the statistics.
Oh, yeah.
There's 60 different ethnic groups in Burkina Faso. There's at least 3 major spoken languages outside of French. And so again, it's not about the differences between these groups, the differences between these language. French serves as that catalyst because it is present over the situation.
But to that point, the language is spoken, the official language is French, but over 60 are spoken, and then the next one, 53%. Then they're into single digits right after that. So, you're becoming more and more
isolated
as you go along. And so the idea of trying to build a revolutionary movement around one of those other languages is automatically a limiting factor. I was thinking of it in the context of the United States, like the colonized land of Turtle Island, right? Like how many indigenous languages were spoken here? And to try to create some sort of revolutionary movement around one of them, you're automatically cutting yourself off at the knees. You know what I mean? Like you said, it is present in the revolutionary moment.
Yeah.
So that is the language that should be spoken because it is the thing that will allow us to move forward. I can see a reasonable dialectical critical analysis of why that is both necessary and contradictory to the revolution. You know what I mean?
So many things. Language is such an interesting avenue to talk about this because there's so many different examples in history where it comes into play like that. Like a weird one that just popped into my head is the Communist Party in the United States. Very early on in its formation, there was a significant communist present in the U.S. A lot of it was in foreign language parties. They were immigrant brigades, essentially, like the Finns. The Finns were crazy, the Latvians, those guys. Just like you said, it's like there is an analysis necessary because everybody in those groups spoke Finnish. If the purpose is making revolution in America, then it's not going to be in Finnish, man.
Yeah.
So I don't know. There's just something really there. And I think that, again, I'm just thinking again about Sankara talking about the universal French. Like he's really he's reclaiming French, essentially. He's saying like, this language is already here. We can use it and prove that it is not necessarily something that is just Parisian. I don't know. If you've got a good communist linguistics recommendation, you can let us know. leftandredfeedback@gmail.com.
Are we getting too far in the weeds when we're talking about linguistics?
I just think that I have had a personal fascination with like etymological studies and that kind of stuff for a while. And so language is always kind of on my mind because I think I do agree with Stalin that it's kind of outside of the boundaries of class in that sense. I think it has a very dynamic relationship with class.
I would agree with that. As a former English teacher, I think a lot about my hang-ups with the way we write and speak and how much of those are just effectively, emblems of the ruling class, emblems of the ruling order. The fact that I scoff when people say who instead of whom in the moments when they should, when it's being used objectively and not subjectively, is, not only makes me insufferable for that, but when I examine that, like where is that coming from? That ultimately it's a tool of the ruling class, like a class separator. You know what I mean? And coming from the places where I come from, the people from whom I have emerged, like there are a lot of colloquialisms, there's a lot of idiolectic speech that I have no problem with, but people of the upper crust might take umbrage with, you know what I mean? And so I do think that there's a relationship to class that is kind of almost unable to be separated from language. So I don't know that I would agree with the notion that it is outside of class. I think it is imbued in class, but I don't think it is entirely emblematic of class. I think that to call it a dynamic relationship, I think is fair.
Yeah. Well, it just made me think of, honestly, is our own discussions about the kind of intellectualization of theory. In what ways are we talking about dumbing down our language being reflective of that class dynamic within language? How much is intellectualization possible outside of a class structure? I'm sure that we're both of the opinion that the masses can understand anything, period. But when it comes to like, I'm going to dole out this theory and like, what language is it going to be in? Not talking about English, French, Spanish, whatever, but like literally the wording on the page. That's an important conversation that I think that people kind of shirk around because they're willing to say like, oh, you got to read the theory or whatever. Not shirk around it. I'm just saying that it's another complex and dynamic discussion within the its relationship to class.
I had two quotes to throw out kind of related to that. On 43, it is a revolution occurring in a country still characterized by the lack of an organized working class conscious of its historic mission, in which therefore possesses no tradition of revolutionary struggle. He's talking about the August Revolution in Burkina Faso there, and I think the same thing is true in the United States. U.S. history of class struggle is erased largely because we are taught by the ruling class, and so that history is, at the very least, sanitized to try to mitigate issues of consciousness, class consciousness, like swelling up in the people. But he also says on 54, in his discussion about his battle against illiteracy in Burkina Faso, which was like 98%, he was like pretty fucking crazy. He says, any policy of fighting illiteracy without the participation of those most concerned is doomed to failure. And so, I don't know, I think that that's tied up here in the same sort of thing, like everything's fucking dialectical, but we have to find that kind of balance between meeting the people where they are and bringing them to the theory without it being, you know, so distilled that it is no longer resembles its true revolutionary character. You know, I don't know. I think there's something about language in there. Like, you can use $10 words to talk about theory. You can use common language to talk about theory. As long as the essence is there, I think that it's valid. But both parties, the teacher and the taught, need to enter that with an understanding and intention that, I don't know, I think can be muddied.
You know what I'm thinking of, man? Something we talked about a long time ago when we were talking about teaching. And it was the idea, the concept of you got to know the rules to break them. You know what I mean? It's a difference in what the focus is on. The purpose of teaching these rules, so to speak, is for you to then break them. The structure that the language provides, maybe in its class dynamic, is still necessary to understand for then to be transcended. And in the same way, it kind of makes me think about communism. We have to understand the development of capitalism to then utilize that central experience and build socialism and communism off of it. And so what we're saying here is that we are in favor of teaching the rules, right? Teaching the French, so to speak, because the purpose is to transcend it. The purpose is to break the rules ultimately, to move past them but you have to, not to internalize them, but to understand them first. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's beautifully said. I love that language of transcendence there, because on one hand, it's understandable to reject learning certain things. Like, I'm not going to learn that. That's the language of the oppressor. I'm not going to learn that, you know, whatever. But like you said, if you reject it wholeheartedly, there's no way you will ever transcend it. You will always, to some degree, be under its thumb.
Yeah. Even in reflection, you know, even thinking about you in opposition to it. If your goal is to transcend it, like we said, then it's much more effective to embrace it and then to turn it. Because if you set yourself in opposition to it, then you're just a reflection of it. Kind of giving black skin, white masks there.
Yeah, that's good. Okay.
I got to give a huge shout out to Thomas Sankara for his position on women.
Yeah, I wrote based feminist Sankara somewhere. Let me find it.
You know, crazy to think that it's often stated that he's the first African leader to include women in the military and the government. Wow, very cool.
Yeah, he says that the revolution imposes 3 missions, and the second one is in regard to the Voltaic women. The Voltaic woman, her role in the democratic and popular revolution. This is on page 50. He says that the weight of age-old traditions in our society has relegated women to the rank of beasts of burden. And he says, first, they experience the same suffering as men, and second, they are subjected to additional suffering by men. That alone is a really fucking poignant and beautiful position, I should say. I love to see him say that. And he says, by changing the social order that oppresses women, the revolution creates the conditions for their genuine emancipation. And he says on the next page that emancipation, like freedom, is not granted, it is conquered. So his position is not one of a kind of patriarch that's like granting freedom to women. He says, we will create the conditions where women can emancipate themselves.
Yes, dude. You skipped all of the parts that I thought were the best of that page because on 51, this is where we're at. He says 2 things. First is that when we're talking about equality, it's not something mechanical. It's not a mechanical equality, you know, drinking, smoking, and wearing pants, which I think is hilarious.
Real men shit.
Yeah, real men shit, right? But he says that one that compels men to give their respect and consideration, right? Like you said, it's not granted, it is conquered. And then it is for women themselves to put forward their demands and mobilize them. On top of that, right, the position of the state in this is not giving the decree from on high. It is simply one that creates the necessary conditions to allow Voltaic women to achieve complete and total fulfillment. You know, and I just think that that's just so fantastic, man.
Yeah.
Killer.
Yeah. Shout out based feminist Sankara.
Yeah, what a beast. You know, he says, he does say women hold up half the sky. Another throw to Mal. Very cool.
Yeah. Okay, let's jump into the cavalcade of quotes. There are quite a lot of doozies. I really love the way he turns a phrase. So,
First one I've got is on page 34. Well, two things here, really. One, he's talking about the parasitical bourgeois class, and he's talking about the cycle of tax breaks. And he says that in this never-ending fight, the worker is always the loser, which I really like. Yeah. And in the next paragraph, he says that it is from their labor that all those voltaics from whom Upper Volta is an El Dorado line their pockets. You know, it's like all of the wealth that imperialism has stolen from this land has come from the labor of the people.
Yeah, he says at the top of that page, talking about the workers there, that their entire wage is spent before it has even been received, and this vicious cycle goes on and on with no perspective of being broken. Sounds fucking familiar.
Yeah, no joke.
I actually really liked on the page previous to that, on 33, you already made reference to this. You alluded to it before, but it's just a great phrase.
Yeah.
With the crumbs of this plunder that fell to them, they were transformed little by little into a genuinely parasitic bourgeoisie that no longer knew how to control its voracious appetite.
Yeah. No longer knowing how to control its voracious appetite. It's like, it's not even its intention. It's just something that is happening. Yeah. It's good stuff. I mean, especially when you consider that, I don't remember the exact date, but Burkina Faso had been independent for a little bit at this point. There was one president before, since independence, and I think he was there for 12 years, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe longer than that. So,
I feel like it was in the 70s.
I think it was in the 70s, but I just don't know the exact year. So Thomas Sankara is speaking from experience here. He's talking about literally watching this bourgeoisie, these people that he was in union with for the sense of achieving liberation, achieving independence, create these systems, create these structures that just reinforce imperial domination. They create neocolonialism. And even if it's not the intention of these people, it's just what happens.
Yeah, and I know that I have in the past talked about how I think to try to separate moralism from Marxism is often a mistake. I do think this is an example where to cast moral judgments on individuals is ultimately pointless, because it's the systems that are going to perpetuate these things. The systems are the things that are putting these individuals in such a position where these actions that we might deem morally impermissible can be judged. Removing the person doesn't change the system. It's just going to the system will just replace that person with another person that is forced into morally impermissible behavior. You know what I mean? So that line about no longer knew how to control its voracious appetite. It's not about individuals making individual choices. It's about individuals being put into a position of a system that forces them along a certain path.
Yeah.
Oh, I guess since we're right here on 34 also, on that second paragraph, he says, the breadth of those struggles sometimes compels the neocolonial authorities to grant concessions, but they simply take back with one hand what they give with the other.
Yeah.
This is a great encapsulation of why reform can never be trusted. And, look at countless examples of where concessions have been won and then walked back. I'm thinking specifically about Roe in this context, Roe v. Wade, but you can't trust reform. You can't trust reform.
Yeah. I love on page 40, there's a great quote right under where he's talking about cultivating revolutionary mistrust. I'll just read this paragraph. He says, the reactionary forces that base their power on traditional feudal type structures of our society. In their majority, these forces were able to put up staunch resistance to French colonial imperialism. But ever since our country has attained its national sovereignty, they have joined with the reactionary bourgeoisie in oppressing the voltaic people. These forces have put the peasant masses in the position of being a reservoir of votes to be delivered to the highest bidder. I just think that that's so apt. Just a reservoir of votes. It's like choosing who represses you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Choosing who represses you again.
Such is the nature of electoralism. Which democratic socialist are we going to put into power just so they can fucking accede to the Democrats?
Hey, man, take a second and ride the high, okay? The DSA, they're doing something right now. I don't know if it's it, but they're doing something.
Something is being done.
Something is being done, yes.
Yeah, I mean, he says on 47, he's talking about a change in revolutionary consciousness, allowing the people to become architects of their own happiness. And he says to do this, the revolution, whether the conservative and backward forces like it or not, will be a deep and total upheaval that will spare no domain, no sector of economic, social, and cultural activity. Again, kind of that intersectional approach that he's recognizing there, that you can't change one without changing the others. And in fact, the point is to change it all. It's not purely an economic revolution. It's not purely a social revolution. It's not purely a cultural revolution. By having a revolution in one, you will have a revolution in the others.
Yeah, total transformation. I love, this is to skip ahead a little bit, but on 54, he says, culture in a democratic and popular society should have a threefold character: national, revolutionary, and popular. Everything that is anti-national, anti-revolutionary, and anti-popular must be banished. To the contrary, our culture extols dignity, courage, nationalism, and the great human virtues. You know, it's like, it is total mobilization in that sense. I even love further on, it's on 65, he says that, it is both necessary and urgent that our trained personnel and scribes learn that there's no such thing as unbiased writing. In these stormy times, we cannot leave our enemies of yesterday and today with an exclusive monopoly over thought, imagination, and creativity. So, yeah, just as you said, you have to mobilize everyone. Everything must be changed. Everything must be revolutionized.
Exactly.
Yeah. Just to keep kind of going in order here, on page 48, he talks a little bit about the military, and that's something that I appreciated because, one, in the means of defense, he's talking about training more people in the military.
Yeah.
But then he also talks about changing what the military is actually for. And this is just in the middle of the page, but he says that one of the missions of the armed forces is to participate in national production. The new soldier must live and suffer among the people to which he belongs. The days of free-spending army are over. From now on, besides handling arms, the army will work the fields and raise cattle, sheep, and poultry. It'll build schools and health clinics and ensure their functioning. It will maintain roads and will transport mail, the sick, and agricultural products between regions by air.
Yeah.
You know, again, just a total transformation.
Yeah, I wrote mass line next to that, and I agree with almost all of those things that every soldier should do.
Right.
And I actually just have the next paragraph entirely highlighted, and I just wrote, hell yeah, because he wants to train each soldier as a revolutionary militant. Gone are the days when the army was declared to be neutral and apolitical, while in fact serving as the bastion of reaction and the guardian of imperialist interests. Gone are the days when our national army conducted itself like a corps of foreign mercenaries in conquered territory. Those days are gone forever. Armed with political and ideological training, our soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and officers engaged in the revolutionary process will no longer be potential criminals, but will instead become conscious revolutionaries at home among the people, like a fish in water.
Oh, yeah.
It's fucking great.
Yeah, potential criminals especially. I will say that it's something to be said about that, right? Because he also mentions that when he talks about the lumpen proletariat. Mm-hmm. You know, when he's describing the different classes that, you know, make up voltaic society, he talks about the lumpen proletariat. And he says really simply, to the extent that the revolution can provide them something useful to do, they can become its fervent defenders. And I just think that's so real, man. It's like, yeah, just involve them.
Yeah.
You know, is this a mass line or not?
Yeah. He says that in part because he says that they are prone to hire themselves out to the reactionary and counter-revolutionary forces to carry out their dirty work if they're left to do nothing in the revolution, you know?
Right.
Because they gotta fucking get by. So he's saying, don't let them do that. Don't leave them to that.
Yeah. I appreciated that.
One quick one on the bottom of 70 when he's addressing the UN. He's talking about the rich and privileged countries, and he says, men whose smart appearance is threatened by too many calories in their overly rich meals. And I said, hey now, back off.
Yeah. I do love on 66 when he says, the poor man's grain indeed fattens the rich man's cow.
Yeah.
I think that that's a perfect analogy in so many ways. And he puts it in quotes. I don't know what it's from. I thought it might be something biblical, but I couldn't find anything like that.
It could be. I don't know. He does quote Shakespeare quite a bit also. I mean, he even refers to Prospero a couple of times. But I'm not sure. I didn't look it up.
A great analogy. Just a wonderful metaphor, though, because it's like you could just eat the grain. Not only is the rich man taking your grain, he's taking it for his cow.
Who you telling, brother?
I know. That's why when I read that, I was like, oh, delightful.
Yeah. Actually, talking about literary illusion, though, even though we're not sure where that one came from, one that's maybe deliberate or maybe inadvertent, maybe I'm applying it. On 105, in his speech about Che Guevara, he says, Che was both the heart that spoke and the bold and vigorous hand that took action. And that heart-hand metonymy, I guess, made me think of Percy Shelley's Ozymandias. Not to be the English teacher nerd in the room or whatever, but, you know, in Ozymandias, that poem is about a former leader and the statue that they're come across in the desert that's toppled over. You know, look upon my works, ye mighty, in despair, that thing. But in that poem, it mentions the heart that mocked the hand that fed, which is, I think, the perfect embodiment of the imperialist power. And so maybe he was making that deliberate. Maybe not. Maybe I'm applying it, but I thought it was cool nonetheless.
It is cool. I'm going to give it to him. Great job.
I also have another really cool one on 77 since I was still open right here.
Yeah.
He says, the quest for peace goes hand in hand with the firm application of the right of countries to independence, of peoples to liberty, and of nations to an autonomous existence. Yeah, and I just wanted to point that out, like the idea that imperialists can hold any claim to peace is just so silly. And I like that he's calling that out right before he starts talking about Israel and Palestine. Mm-hmm. So fucking good.
You know, and also, again, to talk about him kind of toning down his rhetoric at the UN, he does criticize countries that would otherwise you might think of him as allies, like Libya. You know, he's criticizing Gaddafi there for his invasion of Chad. Which is, Gaddafi, yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, and also the big one, right? He talks about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which is still ongoing. It lasted for 10 fucking years, basically. So...
Hey, I've seen Rambo First Blood Part 3. I know all about it. Where he goes and assists the Afghan people.
Yeah, the Afghan people. Dude, when he does their horseback goat catching game and he beats the natives to show... it's fucking awful, man. Whatever. Anyway.
Yeah.
When he's talking about... This is, again, when he's talking to the conference of... I keep the forest people is what I want to say. He proposes that we spend 1% of our money on space exploration for ourselves. You know?
Yeah, take 1% of that space exploration budget and spend it on something that actually fucking matters. And he does even, he says that bit where he's like, I don't remember exactly what he says, but he says like, I'm as interested in Martians as everyone else, but like, let's be real. Let me find the quote.
Yeah, it's on 92.
Okay.
He says, we have not abandoned hope that a dialogue with the Martians might lead to the reconquest of Eden, but in the meantime, Earthlings that we are, we also have a right to reject a choice limited simply to the alternatives of hell or purgatory.
Yeah.
Incredible, dude. Yeah. You know, and just to reflect on that for a second, what a goddamn bummer, too, because, like, space exploration, that's not the budget I was thinking of, honestly.
Yeah.
To follow up that with another Sankara quote, I had skipped this one earlier, but I think it is actually quite nice. On 71, he says that, this is why my heart beats naturally on behalf of the sick who anxiously scan the horizons of a science monopolized by arms merchants.
Damn, yeah.
You know? Same with space exploration. If you really give a fuck about space, you also should be pissed off at the military, man. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lastly, on 93, we lack the funds to drill wells for drinking water 100 meters deep, while money abounds to drill oil wells 3,000 meters deep.
Yeah. I'll just close with Homeland or Death, we will win.
Hell yeah.
Fuck yeah.
What questions did this leave you with, Aaron?
Well, I mean, I am very ignorant of the history of Africa as a continent, and especially ignorant of the histories of colonization and resistance to colonization in Africa. So the questions are, when are we going to read Walter Rodney, I guess? That would be one for me. I haven't formulated it yet, but maybe I have a question around repression. You know, talking about Sankara and his assassination at the hands of a formerly trusted friend. And you had made mention before we started that maybe Sankara knew it was coming, and he was like, I can't be the one to deal the first blow kind of thing. Like, obviously that's something that's very easy to judge in hindsight, but, you know, there is a valid argument to be made, not that I am one that makes it often, that, you know, maybe you could go too far the other way on the other side of that, where you become too repressive in anticipation of any sort of reaction or counter-revolutionary movement. So I guess the question is like, where is the balance?
Yeah.
Or dialectically speaking, what is the approach? What is the correct approach?
It's so tough, man, because I just think that Thomas Sankara was in such a tough position in the first place. Like, by the time that he got assassinated, the revolution had kind of lost a bit of its momentum. And I don't know, it's a question of what is fatal to the revolution at the end of the day. Like, because there is a level of repression that's fatal to the revolution. Mm-hmm. Right? There's a level of non-repression that's clearly fatal to the revolution as well.
Exactly.
And so where do you draw the line? You know, I think maybe the easiest and most cop-out answer is that the people draw it.
With the people.
Yeah. And, you know, in the circumstance of Thomas Sankara, and this is not a criticism of Thomas Sankara, the people weren't as integrated as he needed them to be. to stop that kind of revolutionary threat. And, part of the issue with that is that it was coming from within. It was coming from someone who had essentially led the revolution from the beginning as well. But, I think that he should have done something about it, especially if, in the documentary I watched, An Upright Man, which is from 2006, they talked to a general, and the general says, I came to Thomas Sankara and said, we should lock up Blaise Compaoré, he's going to assassinate you. Mm-hmm. And Thomas Sankara said, that's my friend. He has to, I can't betray his trust. He has to strike the first blow if it's betrayal, this and that. And it's like, without sounding harsh, what did you expect? Because there is a world where he's a martyr. You know what I mean? There's a world where his death mobilizes the people to the completion, so to speak, of the revolution. Whatever that means. I'm not trying to diagnose a solution to this problem or whatever. I'm just saying, like, there is something there. And it wasn't there in Burkina Faso. What happened for the next 30 years is that Blaise Compaoré led the country, and he led it back into neocolonialism.
Yeah.
Right? It's still an incredibly poor country. So that's not to criticize Thomas Sankara. It's not. It's just what happened.
Yeah.
Quite a depressing note. I'm very sorry.
What happened is a fair question. Any additional questions you're left with?
No. I think that the question is always, what if? What could have happened? What could have Thomas Sankara done with Burkina Faso had he been allowed? I don't know, man. I have a lot of questions about history broadly. Something that's so incredible to me is that the fucking French president at the time was Mitterrand. Mm-hmm. A socialist, so to speak. That's fucked. That's fucked up. And I'm not to say that, whatever, I don't need to mince words here. Yeah, I have a lot of questions about history here. I don't know. What does African communism look like today? That's a great question.
Yeah, that is a good one. You should read this if...
I think you should read this if the only thing you've heard from Thomas Sankara is internet memes.
Yeah, I think it's a great, primer, so to speak, for Sankara. I feel like I got a good sense of who he was as a person, as a leader. So I like that one.
Yeah.
I don't have any others, no. I think that's it. I thoroughly enjoyed it as a read, and it's a swift 105 pages or something. So
yeah, quick.
Yeah. So certainly no reason not to read it. You should read it if you've got an afternoon.
Right, yeah. There you go. Okay, great. What are we reading next?
Next, we're reading 18th Brumaire. We're going back to Marx.
The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte.
Yeah. Excited to read that one. It's one of the last of the major Marx works I've had on my checklist forever. Yeah,
it is, I find, to be one of the most off-quoted Marx outside of the manifesto.
Yeah.
So it'll be nice. I'm interested. It'll give us a nice window into French history that we haven't really covered outside of when we talked about the Paris Commune, even though I know this is well before. And so, yeah, hopefully you'll join us. If you have any recommendations for us as to what you think would aid in our radical self-education, aid in our theoretical development, as well as any criticisms, comments, concerns, critiques, a lot of C words, you can let us know. leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you.
We certainly would. And grab your copy of 18th Brumaire.
Yeah, don't get left unread.
That's right. Bye-bye.
See ya.